at the White House Extremism Summit. U.S. President Barack Obama calls for resilience in the face of terrorist threats. Experts say African parents must talk to teens about sex to avert a new AIDS crisis on the continent. And a little beagle beats out thousands of other dogs at the Westminster Dog Show and becomes America's new sweetheart. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Vincent McCory and this is Africa 54. Today is final day of the two-day White House Summit on combating violent extremism. And just a short time ago, U.S. President Barack Obama reiterated his stance that the United States is not at war with Islam, but he also affirmed America's commitment to work with its allies to confront terrorist groups.
When necessary, the United States will continue to take action against al-Qaeda affiliates in places like Yemen and Somalia. We will continue to work with partners to help them build up their security forces so that they can prevent ungoverned spaces where terrorists find safe haven, and so they can push back against groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram.
Well, on Wednesday, President Obama told the summit audience that he wants to discredit the belief that Americans and Westerners in general are at odds with Muslims. Mr. Obama says this narrative helps extremists radicalize and recruit young Americans and others. We get more from VOA White House correspondent Luis Ramirez.
Until now, the United States has focused on its military fight against Islamic militants. Now, President Obama says it's time to get at the ideological aspect and what causes young people to become vulnerable to radicalization. After being criticized for not mentioning the word Islamic when referring to extremists, he called for confronting the threat squarely and honestly.
We are not at war with Islam.
Americans have been horrified by images of atrocities committed by Islamic State extremists, some of whom have been recruited from America's Muslim immigrant communities in cities like Minneapolis, home to a large Somali population. It is in communities like these that grievances over discrimination, poverty, lack of education, and corruption make it easy for terrorists to exploit young people, often through social media. President Obama brought together religious leaders, police, and others at the White House Summit Wednesday to tackle the root causes.
If we're going to address the challenge of their efforts to recruit our young people, if we're going to lift up the voices of tolerance and pluralism within the Muslim community, then we've got to acknowledge that their job is made harder by a broader narrative that does exist in many Muslim communities around the world that suggests the West is at odds with Islam in some fashion.
The aim is to come up with programs that will change this perception on the streets. In the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, pilot programs are already underway with the input of moderate Muslim religious leaders, including some attending the summit.
We believe in the right of all people to live in peace and security. Muslim imams have condemned and continue to denounce anyone who tries to use the religion of Islam to support terrorism.
After discussions like these, the question is whether government programs will succeed in steering vulnerable young people toward those who espouse a moderate view of Islam and help negate the lure of extremists. Luis Ramirez, VOA News, at the White House.
Well, for more perspective, I'm joined by Jennifer Cook, Director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jennifer, welcome to Africa 54.
Thanks, Vincent.
Now, we saw the president there saying he wants a broader conversation on the causes for extremism, why young people are lured to extremist organizations. But some people want him to be very specific, as particularly mention extreme Islam.
Yeah, I think he wants to be very careful with his language because he doesn't want to paint Islam with a broad brush. Nor does I think he want to fuel kind of a bigotry against Islam that you do see, and kind of as people don't understand different interpretations of Islam. I think he very much wants to make the point that the interpretations that lead to violent extremism are prevalent only among a very small majority of Muslims. And so he doesn't want, he was very explicit that he doesn't want this to turn into the West versus Islam. Some of the United States' greatest allies will be Muslims in the fight against violent extremism.
Now, one of the things that people have, concerned that they have raised is that many of the young people that have been attracted to some of these extremist groups claim they have been alienated in their communities in the West. They feel out of place. But they will also at the same time say, well, there are other communities that feel the same, but they don't join terrorist organizations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole body of literature and psychological analysis on who is attracted to these groups. Many are kind of young immigrants who may have a foot in two different cultures but feel a part of neither one of them. And I think his call, President Obama's call here, is that it can't just be the government that is involved here. It has to be community leaders, teachers, parents, religious leaders as well, that kind of identify kind of vulnerability and work to address and kind of confront what leads young children or young men into radical extremism.
Which sometimes is mind-boggling because some of their parents came here because of the activities of extreme groups in their countries, in some of the extremist groups there. They come to the West because there's more freedom.
Yeah.
And then these younger fellows who are born and brought up here are attracted to those groups that made their parents leave.
I think it's baffling to the parents as well, who have come to escape egregious violence. But again, it goes to this kind of dislocation of young men who feel a part of neither culture.
Okay.
It also goes to the increasing sophistication of the recruitment tactics by many of these groups, online and social media, Twitter, YouTube, and so forth.
Well, our concern is, not only the kids who are from here, but there are kids in those very same countries that are being recruited daily, whether it is Iraq, Somalia, Nigeria. So is it so much about feeling out of place, really?
Well, and the point was made here, when there are deep human rights abuses, when young men feel they have no economic opportunity, they may be vulnerable to this. That doesn't mean that every young man without an economic opportunity turns to it. Yeah. But certainly there's a context there that may, and money is also involved.
Okay. I want to ask you quickly a question about Nigeria, which has been plagued by the terrorist group Boko Haram.
Yeah.
Now, the government, or rather the Electoral Commission, postponed the election for a few more weeks.
Yeah.
Do you see things changing drastically before Election Day?
Well, you do see a real momentum against Boko Haram right now, I would say. Nigerian military seems to be getting its act together, more coordinated, has seized back a number of towns, has repelled a number of attacks on big towns. Chad is getting involved, Cameroon, Niger. There's a much more coordinated confrontation happening there. Yeah. It happens in a moment of deep distress because of the postponement of the elections. But that aside, I think there is a real momentum right now against Boko Haram. Mm-hmm. It doesn't take away from the distrust of the opposition that this is a ploy to extend Jonathan's term in power.
So some suspicion there. Jennifer, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
All right. Jennifer Cook is Director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. While turning to the Middle East, Arab League representatives are being urged to hasten their efforts to bring a peaceful solution to the uneasy situation in Yemen. Now, the call was made by the country's representative Mohammed Al-Hassami during a meeting Wednesday in Cairo. Arab League members discussed the troubled situations in Libya and Yemen. Violence has escalated recently in Yemen, filling the political vacuum left in January when the Houthis seized the presidential palace and forced Prime Minister Khaled Bahai's government to resign. Tens of thousands of Yemenis demonstrated in several cities last Saturday against Houthi rule as clashes between Houthis and Sunnis in a southern region left 26 people dead. While Boko Haram has struck again, military sources say fighters from the militant group attacked a village in southeastern Niger overnight, killing 3 people, including the local chief, and wounding 3 others before being driven off by security forces. Well, a senior Niger military official says Niger, Chad, and Cameroon are seeking to pin down Boko Haram within Nigeria's borders ahead of a ground and air offensive by a regional task force due to start late next month. Chadian forces have made incursions into Nigeria, pushing back the jihadist fighters. Tihiru Jega, the chairman of Nigeria's Electoral Commission, assured the Senate Wednesday that the time gained by the postponement of the country's general election will not be wasted. Well, Jordan circulated a United Nations Security Council resolution late Wednesday that would lift an arms embargo against the Libyan government. The resolution would work toward halting the flow of weapons to militants and push for Libya's internationally recognized government to return to Tripoli. Now, the Security Council met earlier for emergency talks on the situation in Libya, where militias and two parallel governments have left the country in a persistent state of instability. Following the 2011 oust of leader Muammar Gaddafi, the session came just days after Islamic State militants released a video showing the beheadings of 21 Egyptian Christians who had been kidnapped in Libya. Libya's foreign minister told the council that the world has a responsibility to preserve peace and stability.
Libya needs a decisive stance from the international community to help us deal with our national arms capacity. And this would come through the lifting of the arms embargo, so that the army can receive material and weapons to deal with this rampant terrorism.
Well, the foreign minister also stressed that Libya is not asking for international military intervention. Libya has been under an arms embargo since 2011. Well, Italy has urged the international community to change pace in its reaction to the lawlessness gripping Libya. There are fears that the Islamic State is looking to secure a foothold in the nation after militants released a video showing the beheadings of Egyptian Christians, prompting retaliatory airstrikes by Cairo. And Ridgewell has more from London.
Libyans in Tripoli celebrating the anniversary of the revolution. But 4 years after the NATO-backed overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, lawlessness is breeding chaos. The beheading of 21 Egyptian Christians by the Islamic State, also known as ISIL or ISIS, has prompted fears that Libya is now fertile ground for the group to expand, says Mattia Toaldo of the European Council on Foreign Relations.
There is a pool of Libyan jihadis who have fought in Afghanistan, fought in Syria, and now are back to Libya. There are other terrorist organizations which have an open alliance with some of the factions, and I'm speaking of Ansar al-Sharia, and fighters from Ansar al-Sharia may be already defecting to ISIS and swelling its numbers.
Across the Mediterranean, Italy is debating military action. Speaking Wednesday, Foreign Minister Paolo Gentiloni urged a collective global effort.
The deterioration of the situation on the ground forces, and I emphasize forces, a change in pace by the international community before it's too late.
The Islamic State has boasted of its ambition to conquer Rome. Italy feels itself on the front line, says Toaldo.
The idea of having such a heinous and dangerous terrorist organization on your front yard, because that's what Libya is. It's just 300 miles from Sicily. Then I think there is the migration issue, this idea that jihadis would be mixed with migrants on boats crossing the Mediterranean.
There are fears that Islamic State is eyeing Libya's oil wealth to finance its terror network, says Libya specialist John Hamilton of Cross Border Information.
I don't think it's actually possible for them to do that, but the fear that they could is a nightmare, which Islamic State, I think, are very willing to encourage.
Egypt carried out airstrikes on Islamic State positions in Libya following the beheadings. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has called for a United Nations resolution allowing international forces to intervene. That could compromise the UN's position, says Hamilton.
While Egypt has called for a UN intervention of this kind, the UN is in fact hosting attempted peace negotiations between Islamist groups, not Islamic State, admittedly, but Islamist groups and the recognised government of Libya. They can't really do both of those things at the same time.
Military analysts question how far airstrikes alone would counter Islamic State in Libya.
Yet bringing troops in will be fraught with difficulty. I mean, the one thing which would unite all the fractured groups that are fighting in Libya quicker than anything else would be a foreign intervention.
Such is the conundrum for the West, balancing the risks of intervention against the danger of a failed state on Europe's southern shores. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. Check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, AIDS-related deaths rate among teenagers is rising globally. What health experts say can be done to combat the crisis. Stay with us.
Wherever you are, Voice of America is on air, reaching more than 130 million weekly, worldwide, in more than 40 languages. Online, social media, and breaking news from around the world. On the go, dozens of new features on popular platforms with new apps and trending topics. Voice of America, on air, online, on the go.
Welcome back. It's time for our health updates. Joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with a look at teens, sex, and HIV.
Hello, Vincent. Hello, everyone. Medical experts say African parents must talk to their teenage children about sex to avert new HIV/AIDS crisis on the continent. More than 2 million adolescents worldwide are living with HIV, and a whopping 80% of them live in Africa. Many are not aware they have HIV because they were infected at birth or through breastfeeding. This is Jane. She lives in Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Jane is 16 years old and is HIV positive. Because of the stigma associated with the disease, she did not wish to be identified.
I started falling sick often, so I decided to go to the hospital. That's when I found out I was pregnant. They did the HIV test and I discovered I was HIV positive.
Experts say HIV/AIDS is the main cause of death among 10 to 19-year-olds in Africa. They say the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa will explode again unless parents and teachers start talking to teenagers about sex. There are over 100,000 new HIV infections in Kenya each year, 21% of which are among girls and women aged between 15 and 24. Jane lives in Korogocho, a densely populated low-income area in Nairobi. She was orphaned at the age of 6.
I had a lot of boyfriends because I was just looking for a way to survive in order to get some money to provide for myself and my small sisters too.
Local NGOs and community organizations are trying to help. The Kenyan charity Liverpool Voluntary Counseling and Testing Center provides HIV/AIDS and sexual health services and education to teenagers.
About secondary abstinence, we talk about issues of STIs, prevention, the issues of drugs and alcohol. We talk about how to prevent early or teenage pregnancy. And in case one of them have ever had that or has a baby, how are they able to live safely and prevent infection of HIV in the future?
Kenya's HIV prevalence rate has fallen from 13.5% in 1999 to 5.6% today. Observers say the fight against AIDS is making progress globally. However, current policies are failing to save the lives of teenagers. Jane says it is hard to stay optimistic.
I have no hope, no expectations for my future. All I want to do now is take care of my daughter because I don't know when I am going to die. I am just waiting for my death.
The United Nations believes it can end the global threat of AIDS by 2030 with a push to scale up testing and treatment by 2020. As teenagers are vulnerable to getting infected with HIV/AIDS, perinatally infected children are confronted with many challenges as they transition to adolescence and adulthood. Joining us in the studio for more on the subject is Dr. Stephen Lee, Vice President of Program Implementation and Country Management with the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, EGPAF. Dr. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we talk specifically about teenagers and HIV/AIDS, let's look at the big picture. EGPAF has been fighting pediatric AIDS for many years. There have been some progress. What would you say are some of the one or two key progress that you can mention and some of the remaining challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation has been engaged in the fight against HIV and pediatric HIV for many years. We're in 14 countries, have tested and engaged with over 20 million women over the years. I think the key component to preventing pediatric HIV and adolescent HIV is really getting women tested during pregnancy so they know their HIV status. And if they are HIV positive, is getting them on treatment to prevent transmission of HIV to their babies. And similarly, once a child is identified as being exposed, is making sure that we test the child so that we know he or she may know their status and be put on treatment if positive. So some of the advances that's actually already taken place is we know how to prevent transmission of mother to child, transmission of HIV.
So less children are born with HIV/AIDS. But as we look at the issue of teenagers with HIV/AIDS, we saw in the report that the young woman was infected as a teenager. But these children that are born with HIV/AIDS are confronted with challenges when they transition to the teenage years. Can you tell us about your observation in terms of how this is being addressed? It seems like there's not enough emphasis on this.
Yeah. You know, just this week on February 17th, the UNAIDS launched a new initiative called All in One. And this initiative is to address the issues in adolescents' HIV. The goal of this initiative is to really focus on in the areas where we need to make progress, and for specifically thinking about engaging adolescents in the fight against HIV. How do we use their experience, their knowledge, what they've experienced in developing programs and strategies that are targeting adolescents? It also focuses on getting more information and data to inform programming. And it also focuses on really mobilizing additional resources so that any adolescent who's at risk for HIV or has HIV would be able to know their status.
So practically, when we look at the teenage years, they're thinking, girls and boys are thinking about having a boyfriend, a girlfriend, hanging out, having fun. So how do we ensure that they are not victimized again when they want to get to that step where they feel like they are ready to start a relationship? Yeah,
I think engaging with adolescents on multiple levels is going to be important in a multifaceted approach. So it's focusing on adolescent-friendly sexual and reproductive health programs. It's focusing on community-based testing and treatment and support group programs that are very specific or focused on adolescents. It's ensuring that there are socioeconomic and educational opportunities for these young people who are infected. And then most importantly, as UNAIDS is pushing for, is really engaging young people as mentors, as peer educators. And young adolescents who are experiencing HIV are probably the best source of support for other adolescents who are HIV infected.
Quickly then, how do we address stigma quickly?
The best way to address stigma, in my opinion, is to know your status and to know your HIV status and to be provided with the support for understanding what your status means and understanding how to disclose your status to your friends, to your partners, to colleagues.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Dr. Stephen Lee. He is Vice President of Program Implementation and Country Management with the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. And that's our Africa 54 Health Report for today. Back to you, Vincent.
Well, thanks. And be sure to watch Lino Mudu's health reports every Tuesday and Thursday right here on Africa 54. Well, it's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. An Africa 54 update or a PAP date. America has a new top dog. We'll be right back.
Of demonstrations until the government changes course.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. Good girl, Miss P. Now, the adorable big girl is now America's top dog. Pretty Miss P caused an upset by winning Best in Show at the 139th Westminster Kennel Club at Madison Square Garden, New York. Miss P beat Madison, a Portuguese water dog that is one of the highest winning males in dog show history. But Miss P didn't just rest on her laurels. She later had a possum tour of the Empire State Building, where she was followed by adoring photographers. The Westminster Dog Show is the second longest continuously running sporting event in the U.S. after the Kentucky Derby. Well, next up, Kim Kardashian's younger sister, Kendall Jenner, continues to rule the runway at New York Fashion Week. The 19-year-old reality TV star recently made her mark in the Alexander Wang and Diane von Furstenberg shows before stunning audiences at Donna Karan, New York's presentation. Kendall looked daring in her fitted, sleeveless black dress, which featured a plunging neckline and a band that showed off her slim waistline. There wasn't a large Kardashian-Jenner presence at the show, unlike for Kendall's brother-in-law Kanye West's show last week. Kendall recently admitted in an interview that she doesn't want her fashion shows to become a family affair. Well, and finally, everything old is new again, at least in the world of motorcycles. Retro bikes are making a comeback in 2015. Take a look at this exhibition in London featuring some of the UK's most daring custom motorcycles. Now, the custom scene is becoming increasingly popular in Britain, especially since the broadcast of shows like American Chopper. But why the return of retro? One explanation is that born-again bikers who have fond memories of the bikes they rode during their teenage years are returning to the fray. And that is what is trending today. Well, that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com for more news. Tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight, at 1800 UTC. And in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks a lot for watching from all of us here in Washington. Have a good night. We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. In a lively half hour, news, sports, health, lifestyle information, comments from our viewers. Africa 54, the best for Africa, about Africa. Join us only on VOA.